This recording is going to look at the cellular level of organization, specifically looking at the cell, but I'm going to concentrate mainly on the cell membrane, and we're going to look at transport processes. Now, this particular lecture is more of an introduction. Other lectures will cover specific transport processes. So we're going to be today looking at, or in this recording, the structure of the cell membrane and its role in transport of things across the cell membrane. The kind of a little brief history, something you probably learned in elementary school. You may have heard of the cell theory, where there's like certain tenets involved in it, that the activity of an organism depends on the activity of all its cells. The cell is the basic unit of life. The activities of the cell are dictated by the organelles that are in the cell. I want you to think of your cell in your body as like a miniature organism that performs certain processes that you as a whole perform. And so I want to look at specifically the role of the cell membrane and its role in our bodies. But what I want to talk about first, though, is to show you that not every cell in your body looks the same. The concept of complementarity of structure and function is well illustrated when we look at the different cells in your body. You have cells that are specialized to do certain things. You know, they vary by their shape, their size, their function. So remember, the function of something follows its form, its structure. And so if you look at things like here's neurons in the brain. So here, it has a lot of these processes that you see up here called dendrites, and they receive a lot of information. And the neurons have these axons that you see here, which then transmit that information to other neurons or other structures. We have epithelial cells, different types of epithelial cells that protect underlying cells. They're involved in absorption and secretion. So you see here some cells in the intestinal tract, and we have different shapes. So for example, like in the small intestine, these cells are one layer thick, but they're columnar shaped. But if we compare that to the epithelial cells that line the alveoli in the lung, those in the alveoli in the lung are one cell in thickness, but they're flat. They're very thin. So the rate of gas exchange in the lungs is very quick. Here, I mean, you have a taller cells. It's not going to be as quick, but still only has one layer of cell. The reason why those cells are columnar in shape is because they have to hold a lot more organelles, because it has to produce a lot more transport proteins to allow different things to be absorbed or secreted. You don't necessarily need that in the lungs because it's primarily exchange of gases. Now, we also have, say, muscle. Okay, so you see here a picture of the smooth muscle cell. They are designed to pull structures together. You see here, this is an oocyte. And look at the size of this compared to, say, the sperm. So the sperm have tails, they have flagella. That flagella allows it to be motile because sperm have to travel up the female reproductive tract to be able to fertilize this egg. And if you notice the size of that, it has a lot of cytoplasm because of unequal division of cytoplasm during meiosis. What happens is you have this secondary oocyte that's ovulated, that's huge. It has all this cytoplasm, and it needs to make its way down the female reproductive tract. And it takes about 5-6 days or so for it to travel down before it reaches the uterus. And so it has a lot more cytoplasm to kind of provide a little bit more nourishment for it. It's going to get some nourishment in some other ways, but that cell is fairly large. So we have different cells their structure's different depending upon their function. I might as well mention just one more thing. So red blood cell. A red blood cell has no nucleus. It pretty much is devoid of all organelles because it's shed them. It's like, nope, I don't want this because my whole goal in life is to transport gases. And so it needs that room for that. Because it does not have the nucleus, it can't divide. So it has a certain lifespan, can't really repair itself because it doesn't have all these organelles to be able to do any type of repair. But its job was to pretty much give enough room so it can transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at that cell membrane. So all these cells have different organelles that have certain functions, obviously with the except of their red blood cell. They all have cell membranes. Well, that cell membrane is a dynamic membrane. It encloses the cell. It's going to act as a selective barrier. So it determines who can come in and go out of the cell. It's going to protect it from the external environment. It's also, it maintains integrity of the cell. It responds to certain messages. So what is it about the cell membrane, the structure, that allows it to have this be a selective barrier? Well, if you look at the structure, it's a lipid bilayer. It has, you'll notice here, there's one layer, here's the other. So I'll draw, so they draw them like here, these little heads, and you have this tails. Those are, this actually we can call it a phospholipid bilayer. So the phospholipids, this part is polar. It likes water. It's hydrophilic. These tails are nonpolar. They're hydrophobic. They fear water. And when you throw these phospholipids in an aqueous solution, so in water, the polar heads want to hang out with water, but the tails are scared of it. And so it arranges in this lipid bilayer where the heads are exposed to the aqueous environment, and you have water out here in the extracellular fluid. That is the abbreviation for extracellular fluid. So you see here. And you have water inside the cell, the intercellular fluid. And so the polar heads orient themselves so it's right next to the water, the tails are buried. And so what happens is things that are polar are not going to be able to go through that membrane because of this hydrophobic core. So if something needs to get through, you're going to need some sort of channel or some sort of protein embedded here in that membrane to allow it to go through. Otherwise, it's not coming in. Now, if something is hydrophobic or it's a nonpolar, it can easily cross the membrane. And so based on this structure, it allows it to be selectively permeable. So some things can come across, some things can't. But I want to emphasize that it's actually, when I say selectively permeable, is it can change its permeability to certain substances. Because if you look here at these different channels or different transport proteins, depending upon the state of those channels or those proteins, it may allow something to get across at one moment in time, but at another moment in time, it may not. So that allows it to be selectively permeable. Now, here's again another illustration just to kind of just show you again what I had mentioned. So you'll notice that lipid-soluble molecules can go easily across that membrane. Things like steroid hormones. Another thing that easily can get across are gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Can easily get across. Things that are nonpolar, they need to be able to get through some sort of channel type proteins if they're allowed to come in. Large molecules that are inside the cell are not going to, pretty much are kind of trapped in the cell. unless they're, again, transported by a specific carrier mechanism. And so that's one of the things that we're going to talk about is different types of transport. Now, what we're going to discuss in subsequent recordings is look at membrane transport, how things get into and out of the cells. And so I used that term previously as selectively permeable. Some people will say that term semi-permeable. So semi-permeable means that it's permeable to some things but not others. Selectively permeable is a better term because I had mentioned before in some instances it may allow things to get across and other things it won't. So you'll see here these two things are like, nope, if there's no channel, they're not getting across. Small nonpolar things can easily cross the membrane. You see here water gets across through these little channels called aquaporin channels. So it allows some things to get in, some things don't, but it can alter the permeability depending on the situation. So what we are going to be looking at is passive and active transport. So passive transport are transport processes by which that you do not use energy. There's no energy required for things to move across that cell membrane. One of the things that's involved in it, and I'm gonna make a list for you to compare and contrast passive transport versus active transport. So give me a moment. So I'm going to put passive transport over here and active transport over here. So one of the things that is energy required. Passive, no. Active, yes. You need to expend energy to move something across the membrane, and it's pretty much the expenditure as ATP. Also another thing is what's the difference is, does that substance move down a concentration gradient or against it? Does it go from high concentration to low or not? So I'm going to abbreviate concentration as this. So passive transport goes down a concentration gradient. So it goes from high to low. But active transport goes against the concentration gradient. So it doesn't care about a concentration gradient. So it can go from low to high. Now what happens with passive transport is things are going to move from its high concentration to low concentration until it reaches equilibrium. So equilibrium is reached in passive transport. So I'll put equilibrium here. Is equilibrium reached? So equilibrium means the concentration is going to be the same on either side of the membrane when we're done. Passive, yes. Active, no. I had mentioned again previously the concentration gradient. You see the down means high to low, and against means you're moving things from low to high. Examples of different types of transport, and you don't have to write these down, or you can just do them a little bit later because we're going to go through each individually. So some examples of passive transport include what you see here. So we'll be covering these type first, and then we'll also look at active transport, and these are examples of active transport. So we'll do that in subsequent recordings. So the next recording, you can jump to active if you want, but we're going to cover some passive transport mechanisms.